One very good question that arises out of the study that we did last week. How can we possibly do that? Given the epic scale of Jesus' love for us, how can we possibly love one another as he has loved us? So let's think about that for a moment before we launch on this week's one another command. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 17, and you have the first step in our answer. We can love like him only because we are a new creation. And turn to Romans 12, and in verse 2 you get the second step. We find that this new creation is not to conform to the pattern of this world, but to be transformed by the renewing of its mind. And then the third part of our answer is that we read the rest of the chapter and we see that from that new start and that new mind, which is very different from the world's way of thinking, new patterns of behaviour are going to emerge. And that's how, filled with his Spirit, we can set about loving in the way in which we've been loved. Now, some of these one another commands address specific behaviours directly, and others of them address the thoughts and attitudes of our hearts that give rise to those behaviours. And where we can, we're going to start there in each study and then try and see some of the ways in which the New Testament writers expected that attitude of the heart to be changing our behaviour. So here's today's one another command. It's in Mark chapter 9 verse 50, and for context we should probably read Mark chapter 9 verses 14 to 50. The command is to be at peace with one another. And it's obvious that Jesus wants this state of mind to replace something else. So why not look back at the chapter now and ask, what is stopping the disciples here from being at peace with each other? Firstly, notice from verse 32 that they really didn't get what Jesus was saying about the cross. And then, on the road, they had this argument about who was the greatest. Notice also, danger signal, this wasn't a conversation which they wanted to share with Jesus. Look at what Jesus is addressing in verses 36 and 37. They wanted to be first. They are afraid of being last. Now, when you have this mindset, what does everyone else become? They become the competition. In this mindset, too, greatness is desirable, but because of what it brings you, not because of what you can bring through it to others. Now, I suggested reading from verse 14, because it's important to notice that the disciples have just failed to cast out a demon themselves. When someone else succeeds, what do they want to do? Eliminate the competition, of course. Teacher, verse 38, we saw a man driving out demons in your name, and we told him to stop because he was not one of us. Jesus wants them to understand that greatness isn't measured by the high esteem people hold you in, or by the gifts and abilities that you possess. You can measure greatness from the met needs of those whom the great ones are caring for. If what's needed is a cup of cold water, the great ones in the kingdom are those that run the tap, not the ones that try and impress with their fantastic talents. So Jesus, very strongly, says it's better for us to lose all that other kind of greatness if it's going to cause someone else to sin. One day, all of that rot and garbage will be burned away, and in the meantime, we need salt in ourselves, something that stops the decay, something that stops the competition, the endless jostling for position. So here's something to think about. How do wrong ideas about greatness creep into the church and cause conflict? What can we do about it? How can we have salt in ourselves? Discuss. You might want to discuss it also with reference to Romans chapter 12 verse 5 and 15 verse 5. I say that because very often what opens us up to decay in this area is individualism. When we see ourselves as truly belonging to a living body, then the salt is stopping the rot. Well, now, this new mindset, at peace with one another, of like mind, belonging to each other, what behaviours does it lead to? It'd be good to now read Colossians chapter 3, particularly verse 13, and Ephesians chapter 4, verses 2 and 3. In these verses, what assumptions does Paul make about church life? Colossians 3 verse 13, Ephesians 4, 2 and 3, what assumptions does he make? Let's notice, Paul assumes there will be grievances for us to forgive and bear with. The thought that often occurs to us, this really shouldn't be happening in church, that is just plain wrong. If we assume there should never be anything needing forgiveness between real Christians, what will be the consequences when there is something to forgive or to put up with? And it's not just Paul who assumes that there'll be stuff to forgive. So does Jesus. Let's read Matthew chapter 18 and verses 15 to 35. First, let's think. What is it in us that makes forgiveness so hard? Well, firstly, there's the easy alternatives, aren't there? See verses 15 to 17. Instead of acknowledging someone has sinned against us and forgiving them, well, we could always just grumble and gossip about them. But then there's the individualism that allows us to have double standards, like the servant in this parable, a measure of forgiveness for us that others are not to have from us. And that's what Jesus addresses here. What makes us want to forgive? Surely it's when we see ourselves as part of the body with the one who has sinned against us. When part of my body gets hurt, my first thought really isn't for how quickly I can go and get an amputation. Behind the desire to forgive lies the attitude, we're in this together. I'm not the whole body, I'm just a part. And so, although forgiveness is hard, we make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. Every effort, Ephesians 4 verse 3. The alternative for the body is too ghastly to contemplate, and it's in Galatians 5 verses 13 to 15. There's one more behaviour that this mindset of being thoroughly at peace with one another leads to. And it's actually one of the most frequently commanded one another's out of all these specific actions. You'll find it in Romans 16:16, 1 Corinthians 16:20, 2 Corinthians 13:12, 1 Thessalonians 5:26, 1 Peter 5:14. I think what's in focus here is not so much how, but whom. The kiss was a common greeting for loved and respected peers. It still is in some parts of the world. But what Paul and Peter wanted to see was the public acknowledgement of each other between members of the body. Knowing that their love for each other would be crossing over the usual boundaries of class and culture, masters and slaves for instance, they didn't want that love to be hidden or unexpressed. Last question, and I found this one challenging. Who do you greet, and how, and why? Thanks for joining me.